In this episode, James discovers his grandpa is into some dangerous magic, like, say, necromancy. He also meets an unusual little friend. The shop was full of crystal balls, spell books, Ouija boards, dream catchers, and other items.
This is all fake, right?
James said, pointing at a sorcerer's hat.
Of course it is.
His grandfather said.
You don't think they'd sell real magic to Earthlings, do you?
The old man walked up to the clerk's counter and cleared his throat.
Good evening,
he said and wrung his sleeve out on the counter.
I'm here to meet a friend named Mr. Barnaclavicus. I've heard he's in.
The woman looked up from a mystery novel.
Et à qui dois-je répondre?
Mr. Dreadful.
The old man answered.
Arthur Aldrafus Dreadful. He called me a week ago by this so-called telephone and told me to collect.
He grabbed James by the ear and pulled him up to the counter.
Oh!
The lady smiled and disappeared through the red beaded curtain behind her. Arthur turned to James and smiled, dripping water from his nose.
Your hair looks like Wimplies are nesting in it.
Wimplies.
Little scavenger lizards with human faces. I suppose I'll have to convince you it's all true.
What is?
I have to undo 9 years of Erdling stupidness. Your father was a great sorcerer who saved the world of Nobracoso from destruction from an evil wizard.
You've told me this before.
He smashed the magic armor gods. Those are stones of immeasurable destruction, but he did so only by sacrificing himself in the process.
He remembered his grandfather telling him stories about armor gods a lifetime ago, and how his father had died a hero. But he shook his head.
No, my dad was a banker.
That was what Mrs. and Mr. Brady told him for the 5 years he'd lived with them. He was told the same when he was in foster care.
Yes, a fat banker. I suppose he could have led a boring and tedious life counting pennies, and he never came close to being burned alive by a spike-tailed dragon or getting stepped on by a Brobdingnagian. It was probably just a paper cut from a crisp $20 bill that did him in. Yes, you should go on believing that story.
A moment later, there was a tiny squeak. But it hadn't come from the lady who had just reappeared, muttering to herself. Something had vexed her. She left the counter and vanished in the back of the store. The old man watched her go and turned around to look over the counter. Then, he put his elbows on it again and leaned over farther.
Mr. Barnaclavicus, I presume.
James stood on his tiptoes and also leaned over it. He jolted back, bewildered, as a man the height of an average-sized vitamin bottle walked through the beaded curtains. He wore a pair of bantam rivet spectacles that made his eyes look big, clothes you could fit on a miniature doll, and had a full head of neatly parted hair. James could imagine him being some sort of lawyer. He had the air of professionalism.
Arthur?
Came the squeaky voice James had heard before.
Arthur Dreadful!
I wasn't expecting you to return so soon, but it's good that you're back,
his grandfather said.
I was looking for you, but you weren't where I left you.
It's a long story.
I had to travel. Your old place is a mess, and that Oris mirror isn't there.
But it is.
James was looking from one face to the other in absolute confusion. He shook his head at last.
Hey, how's this guy so tiny?
Arthur looked at him and then said to Mr. Barnaclavicus,
Don't worry about him. He's been made stupid from living here in Erd too long. 9 years, 1 million brain cells gone for each year.
Good heavens! And you let that happen?
Mr. Barnaclavicus blurted.
I had no choice. I was in a dungeon.
Mr. Dreadful, I did warn you.
And I heeded your warning.
You used magic, didn't you? How much damage are we talking about?
Mr. Barnaclavicus inquired, walking out from behind the counter. James looked at Arthur, who waved his hands at him over the tiny man's head. He assumed this meant don't tell him. He looked at Mr. Barnaclavicus and said instead,
Have you looked on the internet?
The internet? Good idea. That's a sort of enchanted grapevine you Erdlings have, isn't it?
Barnaclavicus went over to a purple crystal ball on display and muttered something under his breath. James didn't know what the crystal ball was, but he figured it was some sort of 3D smart TV because he saw tiny images in it.
Does that get Wi-Fi? Try Mr. Dreadful,
he suggested, ignoring his grandfather's shaking head.
Mr. Dreadful.
James smiled as YouTube clips of Arthur Dreadful standing before judges on the show Top Magician appeared. Barnaclavicus clapped his hands over his face and shook his head.
What a catastrophe. You baboon. You do realize that the Wazagat is trying to track down this boy in the old world?
Hey,
James said.
Mr. Barnaclavicius, who's tracking me?
Call me Quizlo, and never mind.
He turned back to Arthur.
11 years ago, I told you to lay low. But you couldn't resist trying to be a wizard.
I was just putting on a show for the Erdlings.
And getting rich and famous. I thought you were reliable to take care of your grandson. You promised you'd be a good spellfather.
I admit I got a little carried away.
Arthur said defensively. James stared at the crystal ball and watched as the old man brought a cadaver back to life.
You used necromancy for Earthling entertainment? For crying out loud!
Shouted Quizlo, as a chorus of people screamed inside the crystal ball.
Well, people were obsessed with zombies. It was a Halloween special. I couldn't resist. Why'd you give me a magic note for reanimation anyway? If you give me a scroll for raising the dead, I'm gonna raise the dead.
There are strict rules on how it should be used, and entertainment is not one of them.
The old man rolled his eyes.
Don't you roll your eyes at me. And I see that you've also used the Traveler's spell for your amusement.
I'm standing in Paris, aren't I?
Emergency used only. I had to come a long way.
You should have used my Oros mirror. It's in my closet.
You forget that I'm 1/100th of your size. I can't search your entire house for your magic teleporting mirror.
James turned to look at him.
And who exactly are you?
I wish we'd met under different circumstances. I'm a friend of your mother's, and I was occasionally an associate of your father's.
Was he really a great magician?
Quizlo raised his eyebrows.
Didn't your grandfather tell you?
Well,
So, he wasn't a banker.
James said. He couldn't believe that both his foster parents and his adoptive ones had lied to him about that. They'd have to have talked to each other about it to keep the story straight, and that seemed unlikely.
How has life on Earth been treating you?
It isn't bad. I mean, there's friends in school.
I'm sorry, but it is most urgent that you return to Nobracoso.
Quizlo cut in.
You'll have to leave it all behind. If you hated it here, it'd be easier.
James looked at the little man, and then at his grandfather.
What?
this isn't your real home. You were born in Nobracoso.
He had to admit, Arthur's delivery of life-altering news sucked.
This was not how I'd expected things to go.
Quizlo said, shaking his head.
Well, he has no knowledge of the old world, aside from what I told him when he was 5. The plan was a failure from the start. Frankly, it's disappointing.
Disappointing?
James cried. His voice crackled irritably. His grandfather's words stung. Seeing the sheriff's department leading him away on charges of arson and endangering the welfare of a child were his last memories of the man. How could he talk about disappointment?
Disappointing?
The anger was hissing out of him like the steam from a pressure cooker.
Screw you! I believed in you for years, even after you'd abandoned me.
He paused, aware that Quizlo was watching him with his tiny eyebrows raised in detached amusement.
I was 5 and you left me all alone in this place. Because you didn't think. You were too busy casting spells and go to hell!
How could he explain that years of torment from kids led him to lash out? That he had held on to his grandfather's beliefs for years, had to endure skepticism, mockery, pity. And he had fought back. Fought to protect the memory of his beloved grandpa. Disappointment. James didn't remember how he'd gotten outside the magic shop. He supposed his feet carried him. He felt he might burst from anger or sadness, or both. Please like and subscribe so you can get the latest episodes of the Midjourney Storyteller. So, trying to create Quizlo was very difficult. In the book, he's a gnome, but Midjourney could only make garden gnomes, so I had to get creative. But there was quite an audition before I settled on the shriveled-up gnome that I found. The audition was, interesting.